Hi, welcome to Orgone Continuum, and this is our monthly talk series on various aspects of orgonomy and my work, changing various of my papers into video talks. And previously we've been talking about a paper I'd written on good and evil from an orgonomic point of view. There hadn't been a theory of good and evil, fully speaking, in orgonomy. Reich's, how would you characterise Reich's original theories on good and evil? Well, we went over this, I think, in the last video series. So orgonomy and good and evil, we've had to put that over two video series. So the first one I spoke about the first essay I wrote on that, which was good and evil, which is on my website orgonecontinuum.org, and but that so that summarizes Reich's view, and it also goes on to give a new view of good and evil. But basically, in a nutshell, it reduced good to a direction of orgone. So orgone moving creatively forward, creating orgone going from consciousness to energy to matter to life. That creative direction we equated with good, and the other direction of that orgone can travel in, where sort of matter breaks up. You can see this in the cancer cells and the T bacilli, where you've got matter, and then because of a low energy charge or some other negative stagnation, the matter breaks up, and so it goes from matter to back to energy to back to consciousness in the end. So it's a destructive process. So the orgone can move creatively, which we can equate to good, or it can move from matter back down to consciousness, and we can equate that with evil. Anyway, I go through that in the last Orgone Continuum TV episode. And today, just going through the second part of it, as you notice that I've actually changed my shirt this time. And I'm in a slightly different location because I've not been feeling too brilliant the last couple of weeks. So I'm just kind of squeezing in this episode while I can. Anyway, so we go to the second part of my two essays on orgone and good and evil is called it's about Reich and Freud and the primacy of consciousness. I'll just give you the title. But if you go to my website orgonecontinuum.org, click on the essays tabs, and then click on Reich-Freud primacy. It'll take you to it. And the full title is Wilhelm Reich, Freud and the Primacy of Consciousness. This laptop I'm viewing it on is a bit rubbish. It's very slow. Anyway, I'll base it a lot more today around the actual essay because it's a shorter essay. And I'll just read some of it and then go off on a tangent every now and again. So after the introduction to the essay, I talk about the Orgone period, because this is what got me to thinking, because that brings me back. Reich's original theory of good and evil was what I classified in the last talk as a medical theory of evil. So basically, when life goes wrong, life gets ill, that's evil. It's kind of similar to the Christian viewpoints in a such, but my theory changed that into good as a direction of orgone and evil as the opposite direction of orgone. But I want to name this TV talk today as Or/Eros and Dor/Thanatos, because looking at good and evil really changed how I saw Reich's view of consciousness, and also it changed how I saw Reich and Freud, because people have long thought that Reich and Freud were opposite, but they're not. They're two puzzle pieces that need to go together, and you'll understand why I think that by the end of this talk. So anyway, I'll start after the intro to this essay. So the Orgone period. During a rereading of the Orgone material, the author has found evidence that Reich may have actually begun to change his viewpoint closer to the author's own view of consciousness. This was before Reich's imprisonment and prior to the spiritual awakening he may have experienced there. It indicates that this possible spiritual change is in keeping with prior changes expressed in published material in the late 1950s. Well, Reich did talk about spiritual stuff when he was in prison, and wrote poems and encouraged his son Peter and his wife to connect with wider realities. But that process of getting there didn't happen out of the blue, like some people have said. Since about 1950, the Orgone experiment, orgone and radioactive material. Since the Orgone experiment, Reich had been on a different path, a less material, more spiritual path. So Reich often waited years before publishing new material. He would make sure he was certain of any new observations before putting them before the world. Also, perhaps he liked to give things time to develop. He was acutely aware of the too muchness of his work. That's a quote from him. The main paper I quoted in previous essays as illustrating his earlier materialistic conception of consciousness was published in 1956. This paper is the re-emergence of Door, the re-emergence of the death instinct as Door, or something along those lines. Yeah, you'll see the full references, and I'll probably put the references on the video, but you can also see them on the original paper on my website, Reich Freud Primacy, on orgonecontinuum.org. So I talk about how he may have conceived of that paper quite a bit earlier than when he published it, but in any case it reflects his views in the 1940s rather than the emerging views in the 1950s, which became more spiritual, I think. And then I talk about how he was under tremendous pressure in the 1950s, how Reich described it as living in a glass house, and he was discovering so many new things. So I'll read from that. At the same time, his life and liberty were under threat. He mounted the first ever desert cloud-busting expedition in 1954. He was under attack from all sides. He was discovering so many new things very quickly, like a post-radioactive substance called orgone charged radium, which he used in cloud busting, making the powerful space gun a radioactively connected cloud buster. He was successfully desert greening in Arizona, at first purposely without creating full precipitation. He was charting the effects of Door, deadly orgone. He was using the powerful Orgone energy. So just to go off on a tangent, sometimes people say, well, is Orgone the evil energy? But no, it's not. Orgone is just excited orgone, excited by nuclear energy or electricity. So you could say the orgasm itself is a kind of Orgone reaction because it's orgone in a state of excitation. Of course, it was the orgasm function that led Reich to initially discover orgone, because he was looking at the libido and stagnation and movement of energy, and that led him to bioelectrical changes in the skin surface with pleasure and pain, and then that led him to look at biological organisms, and that eventually led to finding a radiation from these nanobacteria that he discovered in sand, well, when sand breaks down, and that led to orgone in the boxes. So it's a long story. Anyway, to go back, he in the 1950s he had all the Orgone experiment, which was very intense emotionally for him, desert greening, discovery of a new substance, Aurore. He was encountering spacecraft, and it was an intense and turbulent time for him. And this is when he published his last book, well, his last book that wasn't stolen, called Contact with Space, which I'd really recommend reading. It's an amazing book. Some people dismiss it because it talks about spacecraft but you can find a lot of information on the Orgone motor, and a lot of information on cloud busting and on radioactivity in Orgone in that book. So it's full of experimental information as well as being a record of an amazing time in his life. Pardon me, I've still got a bit of a cold, dry cough. So the beginning of consciousness as primary, because up to this time Reich thought that consciousness was a secondary effect. His theory of consciousness was a systems theory, that you've got a system of orgone moving in a membrane, and that pulsating orgone in a membrane creates perception, and then lots of those membranes integrate in an organism to create self-awareness, self-consciousness. So that's a systems theory. So in a systems theory, consciousness is an epiphenomena, or not a direct phenomena, a secondary phenomena, which doesn't work philosophically. That doesn't work at all. Anyway, in the 50s, I think Reich began to change his views to seeing consciousness as primary, and the reason why he changed his views is connected with good and evil, with Freud, and with the work in the 1950s with radioactivity. So let's go through it. The beginning of consciousness as primary. Through Reich's views on the causation of deserts in contact with space, we can ascertain that Reich was perhaps changing from viewing matter and energy as the primary reality to viewing consciousness as primary. Sorry, you'll have to excuse me, I'm not at my best this month. Halloween and end of October, not my favourite times. Anyway, try and get back on track. So Reich changed from viewing matter and energy as primary to viewing consciousness as primary, I felt, during this time from 1950 to 1957. But before discussing this further, we need to address a central dilemma in orgonomy that relates to this change in view, a dilemma that's been unresolved for decades. So the dilemma for Reich was, where did evil come from? And Reich, like DeMeo, he traced the steps that led to evil, but he didn't identify where evil came from. So Reich identified that you get muscular and psychological armouring, the hardening of the human soul and body in response to trauma as a mechanism of human misery or evil. Reich had noted a connection between deserts and armouring since the 1950s, when his work with cloudbusters and deadly orgone got started. Reich noted the red thread that connects the first formulations between the character armour 30 years ago with the problems of desert development, so from the 1920s to 1950. He traced the connection between deserts and human character, drawing a correlation between the physical desert and the emotional desert in mankind. Quote, desert souls will enhance desert development, and desert development will increase or staleness in the human emotions, end quote. Reich observed that desert life forms tend to be hard and spiky, a harsh environment that can produce harshness in one's character. Reich connected Dor with the actual physical creation of deserts through a Dor substance. Dor means deadly orgone, and that's what really corresponds to the death drive, Thanatos, Dor. It's not Orinor, though Orinor can lead to Dor, but Orinor is just Orgone is life force in its state of natural sort of acquiescence. Orinor is life force when it's excited. Dor is life force when it's dead. He observed that deserts develop both in people and in the environment at the same time. DeMeo had completed a successful MA, Master of Arts, in Kansas University, doing the first academic study of cloudbusters. He wanted to go on to study them at PhD level, but his PhD cloudbusting project was stopped by the intervention of a US government agency, the National Science Foundation. Reluctant to leave his university in Kansas, he turned to another central topic for him, human behaviour. DeMeo took the connections Reich had found between deserts and emotions and developed his Saharasia thesis. I'll put that in the quotes in the references at the end, or you can find it in the original essay. DeMeo found an evidence for a connection between deserts and armoured societies with characteristics such as circumcision, female genital mutilation, lack of freedom for the young, female repression, harsh cultures which spread to the rest of the world through warfare and conquest. He argued that these characteristics found expression in desert cultures, and this started 4,000 to 6,000 years ago, in the Sahara, which stretches all the way from Morocco to China. Previous to that period, 4,000 to 6,000 years ago, the Sahara was wet and lush, which you can see. That's why we know the Sphinx in Egypt is way older than what is said, because there's evidence of rain on it, and there's been no sort of heavy rain in that area since before the Saharasia period of DeMeo. So DeMeo states, quote, "The great drying up of Saharasia was accompanied by a massive shift in human behaviour, as recorded in the stones and bones and other human artefacts of that period. These findings definitively answered what Wright called the riddle of human armouring." However, in the quote above, DeMeo, end quote there, sorry. However, in the quote above, DeMeo goes considerably further than Reich. Reich noted two great riddles: the existence of consciousness, and secondly, why there was an initial creation of armouring leading to widespread human misery. And the second one can be also interpreted as why is there evil, because Reich noted that trauma leading to armouring leads to evil. So they're the same thing in a sense. Well, they're not the same thing, but those are the steps he noted. But he couldn't understand why those steps were there. What was the purpose of them? Wright was the first to note a connection between deserts and human armouring, but he never claimed to have solved the riddle of the origins of human armouring. Wright found a correlation, a step in the process, not the cause of human misery. Correlation does not equal causation. So, so I'm talking about here how none of this is any way a criticism of Saharasia theory itself. It's one can have a connection between catastrophic changes in the world environment and changes in human behaviour, whether this is from Velikovsky, DeMeo, or even in the Bible and other ancient texts, which all correlate various great human tragedies. My only criticism here, and it's got to be seen in context, is of desertification and armouring as the sole foundational explanation of human misery. And Reich actually agreed with me here, which will documented in Contact with Space, and we can look into this shortly. Human misery, which is perpetuated by armouring, is an effect that exists within one's own mind. If it weren't for the state of human consciousness, we could transform the deserts and have enough water and food for everyone. Certainly, if Orgone technology was used fully, everyone in the world could easily be fed, easily have enough water. In fact, we don't even need Orgone technology to do that. Just the suffering is being kept in place, where it takes money and war and effort to keep the suffering in place. And it takes an armoured society to tolerate being treated that way. So human misery, which is perpetuated by armouring, isn't it? I've gone into that, haven't I? So I then talk about it's difficult to treat an illness without knowing its cause, especially one as deep and as intractable as human armouring. So Orgone does not know the cause of human armouring, and saying deserts cause human armouring is fine, but then what causes the deserts? The Ice Age? What causes the Ice Age? It takes you back to the Big Bang, which is also bunkum. Not that Saharasia or deserts or desertification or armouring is not true. It is a true connection, but it's not the cause of human suffering. It's an effect. It's like saying my legs cause me to walk. Anyway, so in an essay on good and evil, functions in consciousness are associated with the genesis of good and evil. So that direction of Orgone, the creative direction and the destructive direction, I associate with various consciousness functions. So this is where Reich and Freud come together, because Orgone is the physical side of Eros, which is the mental side, and Dor is the physical side of Thanatos, which Thanatos is the mental side. They're unified. You can't have one without the other, and this is why Reich and Freud. Reich had the physical side of the death drive and the life drive, and Freud had the mental side of the death drive and the life drive without the physical side. So neither works without the other fully. So let's move on. So where Reich began to think that consciousness was primary can be seen in how he moved from seeing evil as a medical thing, like life force doesn't move properly, which creates stagnation in the human doesn't express itself properly, causes stagnation in the family, that messes up the society, then blah blah blah, evil. So that's the medical thing, or in Christian terms it's also partly a medical theory, in that when you're connected to the highest spirit, you express good. Not being connected to the highest spirit, which is a disease of the spirit, is evil. So that's different to the Manichaean or the seeing good and evil on equal stages, one sort of fighting the other in an eternal battle. Which actually the Or versus Dor thing, or Eros versus Dor Thanatos, could be seen as an eternal battle, but both Or Eros and Dor Thanatos both come from the same consciousness. So it appears dualistic. I suppose it's like an inverted triangle. It's dualistic here and it's monistic here. Anyway, let's get back to Reich changed from seeing consciousness as a secondary effect to, I believe, seeing it as primary. And the evidence for that, it can be looked at how he thought armouring emerged, because he changed his view of the desertification of being the primary initiation of evil on this planet. And this is hardly known within Orgone, because most people don't read Contact with Space, because I don't know if maybe people get scared by it, I don't know, but in Contact with Space he specifically states that the deserts were initiated by an outside extraterrestrial consciousness. Now, whether that's correct or partly correct or even incorrect, it doesn't matter, because the fact that Wright believed that a conscious entity created the process indicates that he believes consciousness is primary to the process that resulted in evil on this planet, which again indicates in turn that he thinks that consciousness is a primary thing in the universe and not a secondary effect. So I'll read from, pardon my coughing, I didn't want to leave, I want to keep these Orgone Continuum TV things monthly, and I want them to come out on the beginning of the month regularly, and I also want to wear my blue shirt and gold tie, but hey, you can't have everything, can you? Or maybe you can. Anyway, Wright believed that deserts were caused by door energy, which in turn is initiated by consciousness. Now that's the big change. From his prior work, he didn't talk about the initiated by consciousness bit. He believed that deserts in Contact with Space, which was published in 1957, were in the first place created by evil consciousnesses in the guise of extraterrestrials. Once created, it is perpetuated by armoured man's outside influence and weakened consciousness and emotional state. This is quite a fantastic statement, and it's hardly ever even been commented upon within Orgone. Right, I'll go through the quotes. These are all in the essays. Wright notes that, quote, "Door is the basic drought supporting factor. Door eats mountains and levels them off to sand dunes. Sahara sands is caked crystallized soil mixed with orite," end quote. Orite is a door, or a deadly orgone substance. Now, Wright's terms for UFOs, both for UFOs and their inhabitants, he had a number of terms. Doormen was one, and EA was another, which means energy alpha. So, which means people who've understood the primary energy, and it also means craft that run on the primary energy. It has a double meaning. I've checked that. So, quote, "EA causes strong door," end quote. Quote, "The American Sahara, the Tucson Basin, the hottest spot in the US southwestern desert, may for 25,000 years have been submitted to EA attacks without man having been aware of it. Were the EA which we saw in the sky possibly space machines which had been keeping deserts going for ages, preventing rain all along the times?" So he's not 100% sure there. I mean, he's saying, well, maybe there are other causes of the deserts, but he strongly suspects that the UFOs that he was interacting with around that time may have been partly to blame for the desert creation. I mean, Wright's interaction with the UFOs was at a time in the 1950s when there was a lot of nuclear testing going on, and a lot of friction between the various states, and there's possibly it could have been early prototypes or stolen Third Reich prototypes or Soviet prototypes, who knows, that were causing to have so much sort of, he noticed a lot of negative energy or dor coming off these craft sometimes, but he was also sort of pointing space guns and cloudbusters at them, so they might have been retaliating to some extent. So his interaction with UFOs was quite negatively charged at that time. So it was perhaps more, perhaps he was pushed to see them as creating dor more than he might have been had he interacted now. I don't know, it's just a guess really. Anyway, he says it more specifically in some quotes here. EA has caused the deserts of the planet, supported by Earthman's emotional desert, end quote. Quote, twig by twig they die until the stem topples over too. Armoured man passes by this devastation over the ages without noticing it. He is slowly deteriorating himself, end quote. Quote, he believes all deserts to have been man-made over the past 25,000 years, end quote. Reich is here quoting a TV reporter talking about him on a local TV station, about his cloud busting in Arizona. The first victories in combating deserts and its makers, the EA, had been won, end quote. Quote, man himself is responsible for desert making and desert breaking. Man has the tools of knowledge and the tools of technology at his disposal today to combat desert development and even to turn existent deserts back into green, rich pastures for man and animal alike. The first obstacle in the way of our desert is not the outer desert, but the inner emotional desert of man, end quote. Orot means Orgone operation in cloud busting. I don't know where Wright got the 25,000 years from either. Wright noted a correspondence of the inner desert to the outer one in the environment, but the inception of the desert process itself he thought was way back in time, at least 25,000 years ago. It doesn't matter whether Wright was right or wrong in the naming of ETs or other persons as the initial cause of deserts and thus armouring. The key thing is he is saying a conscious entity or entities created the deserts, which in turn led to mass armouring on Earth. This is the same as saying a force within consciousness created the deserts. So in effect, Reich is pronouncing the primacy of consciousness over the energy and material functions of Orgone and dor on this planet. Reich clearly spelled out this conclusion in his last book, Contact with Space. Reich was by then on a road to a more spiritual and consciousness-related view, as not long after this time he was of course imprisoned and had a possible spiritual awakening there, as detailed in this essay, and as discussed in Stephen Katz's blog posts and radio shows. At the very least, the armouring change in people's consciousness and the desertification was simultaneous, as anatomically modern man lived through both the prior ice ages and the latter birth of the great deserts. Reich certainly connected dor with social and environmental negativity, noting that there had been a 15% decrease in crime in Los Angeles since his desert cloud busting operation in nearby Arizona. Reich ascribed a functional identity between orgone in the body and atmospheric orgone energy. It chases out dor energy and does battle with it. Reich states, I had the impression of a tug of war between the forces of life and the forces of death, between or and dor. So Reich is now changing from the thing published in, was it 1954, the re-emergence of the death instinct as dor, where he separates dor from consciousness. He says it's only a mirage. It only just happens to be the case that dor behaves like a death drive. But here he's stating that at least in terms of a subjective impression, they are the same. So I do go on to say that this anthropomorphism is the closest Reich gets to publicly ascribing consciousness to Or and Door functions. But if Reich were to stick to his view from his middle period that Or and Door functions energetically but has no consciousness outside of an organism, Reich's statement above would not make any sense. How can a non-conscious orgone in the atmosphere be functionally identical to a conscious orgone in the organism if orgone lacks consciousness in its primal state? This functional identity, but without consciousness, is just an assumption on Reich's part, an assumption without even a rationale. So Freud and Reich are reconciliation. It should be noted that it might not be entirely correct to call orgone simply a life energy. As Reich stated in Contact with Space, orgone is both the force of life and of death. Further to that, as Reich was possibly beginning to touch upon, orgone is perhaps also a non-energy consciousness, a consciousness force. Freud recognized the psychic elements of this force as eros and thanatos, or libido in the death drive, eros, libido, death drive, thanatos, but denied this force a physical reality as energy, although the early Freud, fresh from his neurology studies, did think that libido or eros might be materially based in some way. Reich recognized the physical energetic elements of this force as orgone energy and its counterpart as Door, but denied this two-aspect unified force any psychic reality of its own. Orgone does not have independent consciousness according to Reich in his middle period. It's clear that this view of Reich's was a judgment rather than a position based on evidence, or even a position that he was thought through in any detail. Reich never really examined the consequences of his views about consciousness. He just assumed that orgone had no independent consciousness and left it at that. He criticised Freud's psychological conception of the life and death impulses, but did not examine the implications of his own purely energetic, de-psychologized conception of the same processes. Reich saw both life and consciousness from a Darwinian, gradualist, linear perspective. It would have been very hard for him to imagine either life or consciousness as pre-existing in the climate that permeated science at that time. This gradualist step-by-step structure-building approach also influenced Freud to a great degree. So in the Reichian and Freudian traditional or pre-1950s views of Reich, consciousness would have to be a result of an evolutionary process. It couldn't be what was behind the evolutionary process. Consciousness had to be a consequence. But he was beginning to move away from that in the 50s. Freud and Reich are like two halves of the same puzzle and will always belong together because of this perfect fit between what each man couldn't see for himself. Freud psychologized a dual aspect energetic force into the eros and thanatos instincts. Reich physicalized the psychic aspects of the same force into orgone and Door as pure energy. Both men were correct and at the same time incorrect. As argued in my prior essays, there's some evidence to believe that orgone and Door have their own consciousness. Without a consciousness to orgone, orgonomy can go no further than where Reich left it prior to the 50s. And orgonomy where Reich left it prior to that can't be used to explain consciousness, because if consciousness is a system effect, it is just sorry, I've lost my place because someone's trying to call me. Anyway, let's crack on. So I talk about Freud and Reich as being the two halves of the same puzzle. And then I talk about the re-emergence of the Freudian unconscious. Reich notes he would not have discovered orgone without Freud. Without him, quote, it would not have been possible to penetrate beyond word language, beyond the unconscious into bioenergy expression. However, the unconscious, end quote, however, the unconscious itself, a cornerstone of the Freudian approach, Reich sees as an artifact of repressed orgone. Freud's irrational unconscious is but the temporary result of the thwarted primary functioning of the cosmic energy, end quote. However, the Orgone Continuum point of view kind of reintegrates the irrational unconscious because Dor has a consciousness and Orgone has a consciousness too, and they both arise from the same source. It could be said that these arguments are trying to downplay the realities of energy functions in man's misery, or making Orgone and Dor into mere mystical concepts. Perhaps the author is elevating consciousness as the real thing, which was Reich's term stolen by Coca-Cola, and downplaying the gritty reality. No, human misery and human happiness for that matter are quite real and down to earth. Connections between desertification and societal changes have evidence. Orgone and Dor energy are also real. Matter has reality at some level. Even the most ardent idealist recognises the lawfulness of this reality and tries to avoid undue physical risks. Pure idealism does not explain why consciousness manifests in such a lawful manner in this world. It just observes that this is so and leaves it at that. As Stephen Katz says, idealism is unfalsifiable, but it's a theory of minimum explanation. Idealism can also leave one isolated from the contents of one's own experience. If you divorce the products of consciousness from the conscious observer, which not all idealism does. The main alternatives to idealism also, however, do not work. Like pure naturalism leaves one a subconscious anima, submerged in nature. The other opposite of idealism, pure materialism, leaves one a philosophical robot. You've got, if matter is all that exists, then what is making you say anything, say hello? That matter is making you do that. It doesn't make any sense. And if matter creates consciousness, that also doesn't make any sense, because that means something that's not conscious makes something that is conscious, so that's dualistic. So that negates materialism anyway, because materialism is supposed to be a monistic theory, explain everything as matter or energy. Any theory that relies entirely on matter or entirely on energy is crypto-dualistic. Organotic, what I call idiophysicalism, avoids these pitfalls. It recognises the fundamental nature of consciousness as an irreducible element of reality, but it also recognises energy and matter as real aspects of this consciousness, or unified aspects. It agrees with other panpsychic theories in that consciousness is immanent in the universe, but it also outlines how this immanence actually works practically within an Orgone continuum. It includes an element of idealism in that it recognises the only way to apprehend Orgone is through consciousness. So consciousness is primary rather than energy or matter. But that consciousness is unified with the Orgone continuum. So you can't have consciousness without physicality. You can't be conscious without being conscious of something. Even if that thing is a dream, it's still it's still a real experience, and physicality is only an experience. Anyway, we're getting a bit off the point here. The point is, in a nutshell, you've got Orgone, the physical aspect, which is unified with Eros, Freud's mental aspect, and you've got dead Orgone, Dor, which is unified with Freud's mental aspect of the death energy, or Thanatos, and in between perhaps, or however you want to place it. You've got Orgone, which is excited Orgone. So let me see, what else shall I end this off with. The essence of the overall argument in this article is that the cause of human misery and human happiness lies within consciousness itself, and no system or material event such as desertification can take the responsibility for what lurks within, good or bad. Likewise, no outside system, however seemingly enlightened, can protect us from door and evil. Overly strong faith in politics, ideologies, systems, even science itself could also lead into evil. There is a need to look within one's own consciousness to find the root of Orgone and door energies, the birthplace of Eros and Thanatos. Just as no enlightened system can prevent a door consciousness, Thanatos, from emerging or usurping control over people, the worst of the controlling systems laying upon mankind is always vulnerable to the growth of an inner organotic consciousness, or Eros. From this organotic consciousness arise both Orgone and door energies, and from that comes all that we call physical reality. In this view, it appears that Reich too was on this path towards this type of outlook, as detailed above in Contact with Space, because, as we remember, Reich thought in Contact with Space that deserts were created by an evil consciousness. Reich may not have been fully cognizant of the implications of his EA statements, energy alpha, or extraterrestrial door people in Contact with Space, for a view of consciousness as primary, but he was heading in that direction from around 1951 onwards, this author believes, the time of the Orgone experiment, where he put a tiny little bit of radioactive material in a very strong Orgone accumulator, which one shouldn't try unless you've got a lot of experience and you know what you're doing. So let's go back. The continuity of Reich's thinking in this last period evidence the arguments that have been made here and elsewhere in my essays on consciousness and Orgone. Had Reich left prison and made it to Switzerland as he planned, the author believes he may well have developed and looked into a theme of primary organotic consciousness. Pardon me. The relationships charted in this essay can be summarised as follows. The common functioning principle of organotic consciousness. So at the bottom I've got Orgone consciousness. This moves up and then splits off into Orgone energy and door energy, which Or energy is Eros and door energy is Thanatos. And then if we take those down, the Or energy goes up and splits off into a state of health and an expression of strong life, and the door energy goes up and expresses itself in a state of armouring and a state of death, or sort of dried out, desiccated environment compared to the Orgone energy, which expresses in a lush environment and a healthy organism, a healthy moving organism. So I think that about sums it up. As can be seen above, there appears to be no direct causative relationship between deserts and armouring. They are only related through door energy. So door is what? Door, which is an energy in Reich's earlier conception, but which is also a consciousness. Door Thanatos. So the deserts are created by door Thanatos. The foundation of door is itself ultimately rooted in an organotic consciousness. I'll have to go. Freud and Reich's conceptions of Eros and Thanatos, or and door, are unified in this view, which elucidates both the existence of good and evil psychically and energetically, as well as their life and death functions and reality, and their ultimate transcendence by thinking bodily organotic consciousness, or as shorthand in Latin, perceptio corpus orgo. Right, I'm off now. Au revoir and thanks for watching. See you next month.